Badan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The previous speaker, our good colleague, actually articulated some sentiments that I hold and some thoughts that I hold very well. It's really hard to, it's almost like going to a karaoke bar and singing after a really good singer. But the reality is, and we all know it, we are facing a $67 million shortfall in this fiscal year alone. $67 million. And I agree with the previous speakers also that there are decisions that are being made that perhaps aren't really in the community's best interests, the way that it's really putting a climate of insecurity within many households, just because government services, government jobs, and whatnot are at stake. But I think it drives home the message that if we do nothing to try to generate any kind of additional revenue to make up for the $67 million shortfall just for this fiscal year alone, which ends at the end of September 30th, and without any foresight to realize that right after September 30th, we enter into a whole new fiscal year in which I think the projected shortfall is going to be over $100 million. The previous speaker talked about the transition of going from a BPT, a gross receipts tax, into something a little more visible, which is the sales tax. But over the past few days, I think we've come to realize, at least I've come to realize, that as simple as it sounds to create a 2% sales tax, it is not that simple. I think we've made some good headway in terms of really trying to create a skeleton of what the sales tax should be based upon, the foundation of a sales tax, but we're not fully there yet. And right now, time is of the essence. If furloughs and other services and jobs are cut, this will have ramifications that will go throughout our whole economy. People will start spending less, which then affects the businesses in terms of what they will be able to contribute to our GRT. And so we can even see basically a tumbling effect if we don't do something right now. It is painful. I too am a conservative. I supported the amendment that one of our good colleagues proffered only in the hopes that we could possibly alleviate the burden of a tax increase upon our own people. That amendment failed. That being said, what is left before us? We go back to the reality that we're still $67 million short. This 1% increase in BPT will not make up that whole $67 million. It will generate some revenue, but also provide us some time to be able to put into effect the sales tax that we've been working on for the past week or so. On top of it, it'll also give us time. I know that one of our good colleagues here has a bill that will basically adopt the fiscal realignment plan or create a fiscal realignment plan for this government for the rest of this fiscal year. But without that opportunity to do it, we can't get there. So something needs to happen in this special session. On top of it, there are other bills now that have been introduced that would save the government money as well. But we can't get there, we can't entertain those bills until we finish with this special session. This special session was called in for the generation of revenues to help with that, to help alleviate the shortfall of $67 million. That's what we're here for. But we all, I believe, understand that along with the enhancement of revenues, we also need, as previous speakers have said, we also need to contain government costs and lower them, as well as perhaps allow for reorganization within our own government. I have to support this amendment because the reality is we need cash now. And if we don't infuse any money into our coffers, then we will see that tumbling effect, not just amongst government workers, but amongst everybody with our island. And I think that would be a bigger hole to dig out of. The previous speaker spoke about the transition from the BPT eventually into the sales tax. And if we can see, and once we get better numbers and figures out, if we can see how we can transition by lowering the GRT, or the BPT as it's known, perhaps to a 3%, in which then the sales tax of 2% would take over, really the increase would be status quo if this bill should pass, if this amendment should pass. But I just come back to the reality. As much as nobody wants to see a tax increase, it's a necessary part of doing business by the government. Because in reality, even the cost to the government continues to increase. Every time something else goes out there in the private sector in terms of the increase in price, it affects our ability as a government to also meet those demands. Because if we've been status quo at 4% BPT over all these years, with all the prices going up, right, we're always behind the 8 ball. And so new things have to happen, different things. I think there are some in here who definitely speak to the need for change. You, Mr. Chairman, I know that it is one of your platforms, has always been one of your platforms throughout your candidacy, and many of us here. And the reality is we are in a period of change. We've been in a period of change ever since the military first announced their buildup back in 2008. That really started a whole different cycle that we need to address. Because even with that increase, and the fear that I have is, as this military buildup moves forward, yes, we may see more money into our coffers, which would then, going forward, perhaps lessen the pressure on us to increase, or maybe even give us an opportunity to decrease the taxes. But even that would be short-lived, because the buildup will only last for so long, and we have to ensure that when those revenues come in from that buildup, that the stabilization of all the revenues coming in will drop. And it'll only be at a consistent level after that. But then, like I said, right now, right here, today, there is a major shortfall. And I don't think anybody wants to see the hurt that if we don't pass anything in terms of generating new revenue for this government, the hurt that we will all experience, both in the private and public sector. And it's one of those necessary deeds we have to do. And yes, the previous speaker is right. We will take a political hit for this because nobody wants to talk about increasing taxes. But the reality is, on the opposite side, this whole new federal tax bill actually also increases the amount of savings from taxes to the individuals and to businesses. So in a way, it could be a wash. But without going into any of that, the reality is money needs to be infused. And if we go down this road, technically speaking, this government won't even see any of that income come in until May, We're in March right now. So even right now, even during that period between now and between the time now and May 20th, when BPT is collected, right, we still need to have a lot of movement towards right-sizing this government and making sure that our spending and our cost containment, right, is more in line with the realities that exist today. I have to support this amendment, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Espaldon. Senator Morrison, to close.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank my colleagues for providing, sharing their views, and also respect my colleagues with opposing views. I do recall in 2003 serving in that administration as brought up by my colleague, and I understand firsthand what it was like to serve under those circumstances. I do appreciate the fact, what I recall there was that legislative body was willing to work closely with the administration to get this community through those difficult times. And I thank my colleague for sharing that perspective. Mr. Chairman, I thank my colleagues. They have, as the previous speaker mentioned, there is measures that haven't been introduced. I think the challenge we've been having is we've introduced these bills or these measures. We've tried to insert them in as amendments. They're mid to long-term solutions, and we're trying to incorporate them into a short-term solution. And I think that's where we're having this challenge, and recognizing even with a general sales tax, that's going to take some time. And I believe it is a mid to long-term solution that we need to get to. And Mr. Chairman, just right before this session, there was folks in the business community meeting with me outside, and we've been getting the messages asking for more roundtable discussions. It's not they're totally opposed to these increases. They want to work together. They want to ensure that we do this right and that their input is shared. They have more information they would like to provide. Mr. Chairman, if we recall really closely in the first public hearing, this idea of a 1% sunset, with a sunset of up to 1 year, was recommended by one of these individuals from our business community that had served in this body at one point. And I'm sure it pained him to share that recommendation, but I just want to make it clear that idea, or this idea of a 1% was sunset, was shared with many of us present at that public hearing, and I think it eventually turned out to be an idea that allowed the governor to proceed in looking at this recommendation. There was recommendations for 2%, with a 2-year sunset. We've tried many options to reduce the sunset provision. I'm just hoping, Mr. Chair, we do need to figure out how to transition to a general sales tax, but I don't think it's practical to that DRT provide that within even 30 days. I think we need to ensure that they maximize every single day given to them to make sure they do it right. So I ask my colleagues for our support. We are trying, Mr. Chairman. I've been reaching out to the administration and working with the colleagues here. I think you all know that with your input, I've been trying to figure out how we can figure out a real solution to send up to the administration so that they can implement it and address this financial crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Morrison. On the Morrison amendment, there has been an objection, so we'll call for the vote. All those in favor of the Morrison amendment, please signify by raising your hands. Motion passes. Senator Torres, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a housekeeping measure, I have an amendment that I'd like to proffer. This is an amendment to that section of Chapter 26, Title 11, which has to do with the rates and the rates that apply in computing, assessing, and collecting business privilege tax. This section essentially changes the rate from 4% to 5% throughout Section 26202. And I believe a copy has been circulated.
Thank you, Senator Torres. On the Torres amendment, that just makes it consistent with the previous amendment. Are there any discussions on it? Are there any objections? Sure. Are there any objections to the Torres amendment? If none, motion passes. Senator Lee, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I've also circulated an amendment to the bill that would be potentially adding a new section 2670. And throughout our discussions, Mr. Chair, I've really been thinking about the impact that it's going to have, this bill will have to working families, but also our local businesses. And I know that in my experience in the business community, a lot of the success of businesses are really predicated around planning and how our businesses are able to plan for the future. And we really want to, I know that I came into this job really eager to create an environment where we can create opportunities for families and an environment where businesses can thrive. And so I'm just concerned that there may be some businesses who have already entered into or will be entering into contracts based on cost estimates that were determined weeks and months and maybe even years ago. So when the contracts are signed after the increased BPT or the increased sales taxes we're considering now, the contracts can't necessarily be amended or renegotiated in some circumstances to accommodate this increase in the BPT or increase in the implemented sales tax. And a previous speaker was talking about a situation that we found ourselves in 2003 that was very similar to what we're experiencing right now. And so I did a little bit of research and I pulled up a bill that was introduced. It was actually introduced in 2003. It was Bill number 88, introduced by Senator Tony Sanford, Senator Respicio, and Senator Cunliffe. And that measure passed and became Public Law 27-23. And just really trying to learn from the mistakes of the past and making sure that we are crossing our T's and dotting our I's. This amendment that I'm proposing would move to create an exemption to the general sales tax. So the implementation of the sales tax effective upon enactment of this act shall not apply to income generated on these contracts. So it's really just an attempt to grandfather in these contracts and make sure that our business community is able to maintain what they've already set out to do, that they won't be negatively impacted by as much by the movement of these measures. And The language has been circulated to my colleagues, and again, this is just directed towards contracts that are entered into or awarded prior to the enactment of this act, and those that are based on bids which were made prior to the passage of this act that cannot be amended or renegotiated following this measure. So I want to thank my colleagues in advance for their support, and I'm open to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Tom Etta, you recognize.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, at the tax forum that was held last week, this very concern was raised also about how this might affect existing contracts, and so with the amendment that was just made, there's going to be this 6-month period. There's going to be this 6-month period that there's going to be this additional 1% increase in the BPT. And that's going to be an added cost to these contracts. And this, I presume, will be significant for those large multi-million-dollar contracts. So I would like to make an amendment to change the title of Section 2670 to read exemption to the BPT increase and general sales tax, and to make the necessary changes, have the legal counsel make the necessary changes within the language, such as in line 2 of the language. But I think there's that 6-month period when this the 1% increase in the BPT will also affect these contracts. So that, Mr. Chairman, will be my amendment.
Thank you, Senator Etta. On Senator Etta's amendment to the amendment to add BPT increase to the title and to allow legal counsel to make those changes as well throughout the amendment. On the amendment to the amendment, are there any discussions? Any objections? If none, motion passes. Senator Etta?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, yesterday we had an amendment was made to Section 26704. That was on page 2 of Bill 248, which basically there was language that was put in there as to when the sales tax would take effect. Well, because of the amendment that was made, which stipulates that the sales tax shall be effective on October 1st, 2018, I would like to move to then strike section...
Point of order, Mr. I'm sorry, to the previous
Point
speaker.
of order?
Just a point of order is that we're still on the Bisco Lee amendment. And with all due respect, what we did is
I thought she finished.
we voted on the amendment to the amendment, but we didn't vote on the amendment as amended. So we need to dispose of that issue first.
Yes,
Thank
that's
you.
correct.
Thank
So
you.
I thought you were amending.
My apologies.
done?
I thought we were finished with the Lee amendment.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Espadon. Senator Etta, are you done with the amendment, with her amendment?
So
Are you done with her amendment?
I'm done with her
Okay,
amendment.
thank you. On the Lee amendment, are there any discussions? Are there any objections? None. Motion carries. Senator Etta, I'll now recognize you.
So, as I was saying, I like to move to strike section 26704 on page 2 of Bill 248, because that section, as was amended yesterday, really now is not necessary given the amendment that was proffered by the gentleman from UMEDIC.
Senator, we'll take a 1-minute recess, and I want to just provide you what we have in front of us. 1-minute recess.
Okay.
Committee of the Whole is now back on. On Senator Tom Atta's amendment to delete 26704. Are there any discussions on that? That was the amendment that was proffered last night by Senator Castro. And so there is not a need for that provision because of the previous amendment that passed. So are there any discussions on Senator Atta's amendment? Are there any objections? No objections? Motion carries. Thank you, Senator. You still have the floor? Thank you. Senator Nelson? Or if not, so Senator Espadon, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So we're now on the bill itself.
Yes, we're back on the main motion, the
Main
main bill.
motion.
Yes, sir. Over the past several iterations of what we've been doing here over the past few weeks, I proposed, and it was passed by this body, an amendment that creates the GMHA Stabilization Fund. And bottom line, because the sales tax bill, the bill before us, basically gives GMH some monies from the creation of the sales tax. Again, this provision, this amendment creates the lockbox in which those monies will go to. And so I'd like to proffer it again to this body. It's been amended into other bills that we've entertained, but it's not in this bill, so I'm asking this body to consider it again and put it into the existing bill before us. And everybody has a copy. It's called the GMH Stabilization Fund Created. And basically it creates a lockbox in which the monies will go to. And again, it will be for the procurement of supplies and materials, equipment, and services essential to patient care and for capital improvement projects.
Thank you very much, Senator Espadon. You're correct that this amendment was heavily debated in a previous iteration of the bill, or I believe it's even another bill that we were entertaining. So on the Espadon amendment, on the creation of the GMHA Stabilization Fund, are there any discussions? Are there any objections? Senator Castro, yes. Okay, sure, we're short recess. Okay, we're back on. Senator Castro?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to rise in support of the mover's amendment. I think it's a great step forward towards identifying a steady and predictable source of revenue that the hospital has been looking for going forward. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Senator Castro. Are there any other discussions or objections? If not, the motion. No objections. Motion carries. Senator Espadon, you still have the floor.
Thank you. That's all for now, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm proposing an amendment to perhaps legal can just put it in the bill as it fits properly, maybe a new section. But this is the, to address the SNAP that we've been talking about. So the amendment reads, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as the Food Stamp Program, is exempt from all general sales tax. Purchases made with SNAP for the purposes of the provision shall refer to purchases of eligible foods as defined in 7 Code of Federal Regulations, subsection 271-2.2. But this is just a housekeeping measure, just so that it's very clear in the law that these I guess consumers that will be utilizing the SNAP will be exempted from the sales tax. And then, of course, later on down the line, we can look at specific exemptions, such as like purchasing, like, I don't know, like junk food or soda or something, or Okay, that's all, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator Nelson, for this amendment. Are there any discussions or objections? No objections. Thank you very much. Motion carries. Senator San Nicolas, did you have an amendment?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, as a standalone amendment, I would like to reference my previous substitute bill, but instead proffer the section on page 5 from lines 14 to 18, the effective date.
Just so everyone can be on the same page, we're referencing Senator San Nicolas' motion that he made earlier. Is that correct, Senator?
Yes,
And page,
yes, Mr.
what page is
Chairman.
it?
This is page 5, lines 14 to 17.
Okay. Is everyone on the same page now? Okay.
Yes, page 5 of my my failed substitute bill.
On the motion that was made earlier?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I wanted to have a specific section proffered as a standalone amendment to the current bill to read, this act shall be effective not later than 30 days after the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan for fiscal year 2018, which reduces net appropriations for fiscal year 2018 not less than $37 million compared to Public Law 34-42. And just for the record, 34-42 is the budget law.
Okay. Thank you, Senator. On the San Nicolas amendment, Senator Torres, you recognize?
Mr. Chairman, I would support such an amendment, and I think that it does at least establish a good faith effort to hold us to a plan going forward to not only have the people pay into solving this problem, but it also holds the government accountable for doing its fair share of solving the problem as well. So I do stand in full support of this amendment.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Are there any others who wish? Senator Ogden and then Senator Ada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I too stand in support of the amendment by the good senator from Talafofo/Dededu. You know, Mr. Chairman, when you take a look at this particular proposal, it does have now components of the tax increases, revenue enhancement. It does have components of the reorganization. And there's one particular aspect that we have yet to adopt and incorporate, with the exception of a reduction in budgetary allocations for the legislature, the governor's office, as well as the Office of Finance and Budget. And that is making sure that this government, as a result of the fiscal challenges that it presently faces with the general fund, that in fact it correspondingly reduces the expenditures, anticipated expenditures for the balance of the fiscal year. The only question I have, Mr. Chairman, is just so that for the information of the public in regards to the $37 million, if I can ask the sponsor of the amendment if he can just remind us in terms of how you came up with the $47 million. And I bring up this question because the initial consideration under the governor's fiscal realignment plan was a cumulative reduction of approximately $47 million. So if I can just ask the sponsor and the mover of the amendment just to highlight how the $37 million was identified, and then I will close with my comments. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator, would you yield to the question?
The question is, how was the 37 million identified?
That's correct.
Basically, this was the amount that was shared with the body over the course of these past several weeks by the governor's fiscal team. We discussed that of the $67 million shortfall, that was a consensus estimate with the legislature's Office of Finance and Budget and the governor's fiscal team. Of that $67 million, the fiscal team informed us that $37 million was an amount that they felt they would be able to achieve in fiscal year 2018 cuts. So that's where the $37 million figure comes from.
Thank you very much. Just to also highlight, Mr. Chairman, I was asking that particular question because I remember a conversation about the absorbable reduction in cost to the government of Guam, considering that Department of Education had already identified approximately $12 million. The executive branch had identified 15. The judiciary of Guam had identified 3.6. And this branch of government had identified approximately $1 million. So in regards to the total number that was identified in one of our previous conversations, it was slightly different from the number that is being presented by the sponsor of the amendment. So that's why I wanted him to clarify it. But I stand in support of the amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Agan. Are there any others? Senator Espadon?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure I point out, and especially for, I know the governor is listening right now, that by passing this amendment, which makes, excuse me, while I get my notes straight here, this act should be effective not later than 30 days after the enactment of a fiscal realignment plan, which reduces net appropriations not less than $37 million compared to the budget bill, Public Law 3442. I just want to make sure everybody in here understands, and especially our colleagues over there, over in the executive branch, that we did provide a transition point, or at least an immediate relief, by doing an increase in the BPT temporarily with a sunset, and I know that's needed, and that effective date is April 1st, right? This basically puts the burden on both the administration and this legislature to pass and enact a fiscal realignment plan if that BPT start date of April 1st is to be realized. So again, we have 2 to 3 weeks to get this in if we are intending for the BPT increase to take effect on April 1st. And I just needed to state that to make sure everybody understands what this amendment does. I don't have a problem with it because, again, it keeps the pressure on us and all the elected officials to keep working. Our work doesn't stop after this special session is done. We have to keep working to reduce the costs of this government. So I stand in support. Thank you.
We'll take a 1-minute recess. The committee of the whole is back on. We had an amendment, Senator San Nicolas amendment, to add a new effective date, and there was a question. Senator Espadon, you have the floor. Before we recess, do you have anything else, Senator Espadon?
I'm sorry?
You have the floor on the San Nicolas amendment.
Oh,
Is there
yeah,
anything
no,
else?
Mr. Chair, I made that comment just to make sure we all understood the ramifications of this amendment. And again, the onus is upon both the executive branch and the legislative body that if we want to see this bill effectuated by April 1st, then there's still a lot of work that needs to happen between now and then. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Espadon. Senator San Augustine?
Mr. Chairman, I support the intent of the amendment, but I don't support the amount only because it includes $19 million from DOE. Throughout all the discussion on this sales tax and everything else, for the past 2-3 weeks, we discussed about the priority of education, priority of GMH, priority of public safety. And I'm only speaking for DOE, but I know for a fact that public safety is impacted in this, and that's my concern. Thank you.
So was that an objection, Senator? Okay, there is an objection. Any other discussion on the San Nicolas, Vice Speaker?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I support the amendment. I think, we've always said that a fiscal realignment is what is actually necessary. I actually think the amount is too low because the fiscal realignment plan that was submitted by the governor was for 47 million in reductions, and that is how we were going to balance 2018 with a BPT or a sales tax. So even with the BPT and sales tax, they were going to have to cut 47 million according to their own plan. And so I agree with the previous speaker about, the concerns regarding DOE, but I hope that this amendment will actually force the administration and the fiscal team to come back with a realistic fiscal alignment plan, a serious one that does not put up for cuts first the Department of Education classroom personnel or, things that would put the safety of especially our youth at risk. And we've been asking for this, and this is what I feel like they have not been willing to do. They've not been willing to do that work, and we've had so many days in here that they could have sent down to us a different realignment plan, hearing our concerns, do they have to hear any more from the community about, what the priorities could or should be? As one of the previous speakers said, we're looking at cutting, or they're talking about, all these cuts for services for kids, cuts for fire services that put people at risk, cuts for buses. Anyways, while at the same time we are reading headlines that say Gita's holding out on the money that should have gone to the hospital. That's just unconscionable, not acceptable, while they send all these threats about laying off people, furloughing people, reducing, the work week. I don't know. That's why I think we should hold them fast to this, that these taxes, I don't support the taxes, these taxes that are proposed in this bill, but if the legislature actually gives this to them, then by all means, we absolutely need to hold them accountable. I would actually make an amendment, Mr. Chair, that this number change from 37 to 47, because that is the only way, according to their proposals, to balance the FY18 budget. And even with the sales tax, and in fact, they threaten it might be worse because of, the timing. But so I would make that amendment, Mr. Chair, to 47 million.
Thank you, Vice Speaker. On the Vice Speaker's amendment to the amendment to change the 37 million reduction amount to 47 million. Are there any discussions on the amendment to the amendment? Senator San Nicolas and then Senator Uggan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the context of the amendment is captured. The reason why I use the $37 million figure that is captured in the two retiring speakers. By going with the $37 million figure, that gives us $10 million in room based on the original projections of the fiscal team at $47 million. That gives us $10 million that we could add back into the equation for DOE, for public safety, or for any of the other critical agencies that were impacted by the original fiscal realignment plan. Also, Mr. Chairman, just for the record, the original fiscal realignment plan also included $12 million in deficit reduction as part of the 2% reserve requirement. So really, by going with a $37 million figure, we have $10 million in play, plus an additional $12 million in the 2% reserve. So it's actually $22 million that could be added back. All of it can go back to DOE for that matter. So I do object to the amendment as suggested, only because $37 million was the amount that the governor's fiscal team said they could manage with, and I think that upping it to $47 million just exacerbates the strain on some of the larger agencies like the Department of Education that makes up the lion's share of the GovGuam budget. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Uggan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I understand the nature of the amendment and the desire of the sponsor to be able to ensure that whatever the governor had transmitted to the legislature certainly reflects the number that this amendment would proffer. But, Mr. Chairman, I have to agree with the previous speaker. I think that when you take a look at the allocation, and we're already about 1 month into the extensive discussion and deliberation in regards to the fiscal challenges under the general fund that the government of Guam is faced with. So I believe that even looking at the $37 million figure with the flexibility, the administration, and this is all documented because for some odd reason, misinformation keeps coming out. But when the administration presented a $47 million cost reduction, that is what was the part of the assessment by the Office of Finance and Budget. Now we are looking at a $37 million figure. That's less the $10 million that otherwise the administration would have imposed in the budgetary cuts. So if you take a look at that, you take a look at DOE's numerical figure that they provided us without impacting the classrooms, with two exceptions: the procurement of textbooks for this fiscal year, and also I believe it's the initiation of pre-K into the school system. With those two exceptions, DOE, with the under the direction of Mr. John Fernandez, was able to identify $12 million that they could possibly reduce that agency's budget. So if you take a look at the $10 million threshold, and the previous speaker also alluded to the $12 million debt reduction component, you take a look at that $22 million that could possibly be utilized in terms of ensuring that DOE gets the necessary funds that would provide them continuation of our educational system for the balance of this fiscal year without any major interruptions and not impacting the classrooms directly. And then you look at some of these other agencies such as GPD and Guam Fire Department, and perhaps we can extend that to non-general fund allocations to our parks and our pools, and our playfields. But in this particular case, Mr. Chairman, I just want to say that I believe that there's sufficient flexibility with the numerical figure of $37 million at this point in time, and it would provide for GDOE to minimize any negative reduction in their budget so that it doesn't impact the classroom. So I want to just share that particular concern in terms of possibly adjusting that figure upward. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Uggan. Senator Lee. You're good? Okay, on the amendment to the amendment, are there any other discussions? Yes, Senator Castro. You want to state your question first?
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm referencing 3 different documents here, and I just want to echo the concerns with one of the previous speakers about the Department of Education in terms of a $18 to $19 million cut. So the retiring speaker was referencing the first round at say $12 million, there's a phase 2 that may go into effect this evening or as early as tomorrow. So my question for the retiring speaker is, could you share for the record what those rounds of cuts at $12.1 million would do to the department? Because it's my understanding that the cuts are in the event additional revenues are not received. Just because they're making the cuts does not necessarily suggest that the department can operate optimally. Phase 2 and Phase 3 is articulated in the superintendent's letter, but I'd just like it to be read into the record if the retiring speaker could share his knowledge about what that first round of $12.1 million means to our school system.
Senator, would you yield?
First of all, Mr. Chairman, I'm not in any position to be able to identify specifically what the $12 million figure was. That was provided by Mr. John Fernandez, if you recall, a couple of weeks ago when he was invited to share some information in terms of any possible reduction. But you know, Mr. Chairman, if in fact the revenue enhancement in here is sufficient to be able to ensure that DOE, as well as public safety, receives minimal, if not zero, reductions in the budgetary allocation for this fiscal year, then that would be the ideal situation. That would be the ideal situation, Mr. Chairman, to ensure that this budget provides at least the Department of Education, the Guam Police Department, the Guam Fire Department, and our law enforcement agencies with all of the funding allocated to the agency in this fiscal year's budget. There's a purpose behind ensuring that the reorganization was inserted in here into this piece of legislation, Mr. Chairman, so that we can realize some streamlining in our government. We can cut the red tape and look at serious cost reductions and consolidation of agencies and functions in this government. And then it would result in giving DOE the full allocation, not less $12 million, the full allocation of what was provided in this fiscal year's budget. So I think it's very unfortunate that the previous speaker or the individual that's asking the question, Mr. Chairman, is trying to assert that I am the one that proposed the $12 million budget reduction, when in fact that figure came directly from the Superintendent of Education, and he specifically stipulated that that reduction would not touch the classrooms, the instructional classrooms, with the exception of the textbooks of $1.5 million, as well as the pre-K. So I am not going to take ownership of that particular figure. That was Mr. Fernandez that shared that information with all of the senators in this hall, inclusive of the senator that asked me to be able to provide the response. But Mr. Chairman, I think in this case, when you're looking at reorganization, consolidating functions and services, making sure that we streamline this government and that we cut the red tape and we save some money, then perhaps in that case, as a result of an aggressive action on that, with the provisions provided in this bill for reorganization, that it would realize sufficient revenues to give DOE what they should get for the entire fiscal year, as well as our public safety agencies. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Castro.
Mr. Chairman, I don't think it's ever misfortune upon the listening audience or this body when we ask a question for clarity. So pagwidza astia bisang anigwi munga muna lebuki fino senador. What I would like to reference, though, as a matter of fact, I in no way suggested he recommended the 12.1 million. I'm just asking for an articulation, because anytime you cut into the DOE budget, there is an impact. What I do know is what I have in front of me in terms of the governor's letter, his stated commitment to cut by $30 million based on a revenue source at 2 points. I'm referring to the governor's letter of February 23rd. Now, if we can get certain assurances by the original mover of the amendment that the department will not be cut further or anywhere near close to Phase 2 or Phase 3, that perhaps it can allay some of our concerns, at least from the retiring Speaker, Senator San Agustine's vantage point. I stand in opposition to the amendment and in affirmation of Senator San Agustine's concerns about the potential impact upon the Department of Education. And I encourage us to consider, at the very least, the $30 million figure that Governor Calvo had put forward in his letter dated February 23rd. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Castro. There's an objection to the amendment. Would you like to close?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Yes. I just want to point out that it was around February 13 when Bibi Omar calculated that the government of Guam might see an impact of $47 million loss in income taxes. And they promised to cut $37 million after sending out circulars and seeing, you know, how feasible it might be. They were not able to find 47 million at that time, but they were pretty confident or gave us numbers that are showing 37 million. It was also on that same day where OFB, the Office of Finance and Budget from the legislature, pointed out that their calculations were that we were going to be short $67 million in income taxes, not 47. And it was when we came in here, subsequent to that meeting with OFB and the SES and BBMR and all the fiscal team, we came in here trying to discuss bills, the business privilege tax increases. Those were the bills we were discussing with this fiscal team when we insisted that if we are going to pass this, it's still not going to make up, if we were going to pass a business privilege tax, it still was not going to make up the $67 million losses in income taxes, and we needed to see cuts. And so by their own calculations, they said 47 million was required. They sent down a fiscal plan, and they said we are only going to collect, well, if this bill passes the way it's written, we're going to collect only enough to make up the balance because they're allocating other amounts to GMH and DOE, which were not included in these operational appropriations. And so I don't think 47, if you put the number 47 here as they indicate is necessary to balance this budget, I think we should hold them to that, and I don't think it necessarily means that we are saying DOE is going to be cut, because what I like about this amendment is that they have to come back with a new plan, and that's exactly what I think they should do. They need to come back with a new plan, and if they come back with a plan that cuts DOE more than $12 million or more than you think DOE can stand, should be able to hold up, then by all means, you know their intention, and let's not go any further. That's the beauty of this amendment. It's because you can see then their true intentions, and you can see what they are really going to do before you put this tax on top of the backs of the people. And I think we owe this to them. And if they show us 47 million and we can readjust the 2% reserve or other things so that we don't actually need to cut 47 million, then that's great. But I say hold them to 47. Let them show you where in this government do they think it's reasonable to cut. Because all they have shown us so far is pretty much places, I mean, not all of them, but some of them we truly believe are unreasonable. They are not, the sign of leadership that we need right now. We need leaders that are going to come in, like, one of my colleagues referred to after a typhoon, and it's exactly what we need. We need somebody to come in here with the best interests of everyone and propose cuts that are not going to make people fear for their jobs, for their families, for their kids, for their safety. That's just ridiculous. And I really believe that we can do better. And so I'm again asking my colleagues, please, let's just hold them to 47. If they bring it back, you have the opportunity to change whatever plan they submit to us. You can reduce it if it seems appropriate, then that's great. I think if we come up with other revenue enhancements in the interim, even better. We can reduce $47 million in cuts, if you want to. But I'm just saying, what's really been lacking in our back and forth is they've put one thing on the table. They've said, we will cut DOE by $19 million, and we are not budging from that number. So if you don't give us our way, we are going to, we're going to do that. We're going to get rid of the teachers in the limited term teachers in the classroom, the substitute teacher. I mean, come on. I really think this is the time. If my colleagues are really going to give them an increased sales tax, an increased BPT, that's huge. It's the very least I think that we could ask is to get some actual, realistic realignment plans. I mean, we are actually proposing to give them reorganization authority beyond a realignment. A realignment of $47 million. That's becoming. It's looking a little bit outrageous to me at this moment. That we can't hold them to 47 million, yet we're going to at least. And we're not even saying we're going to hold them to that. We're saying show us the places in this government that are realistic to cut, because no one believes that we have to cut DOE by 19 million in order to survive. I just think we don't believe it, the public doesn't believe it, and we want to see it. And and we see it in the headlines every day that is just not necessary. And so I hope that they just will take, if this bill passes, passage of this bill with this provision as that's the end. That's the end of the games and the press releases and all of that nonsense, and let's just get to the work. This is the work part. Send us something realistic, and we will deal with it. And I just think that's what the people deserve, and I think we should not ask them for anything less. And if we can find ways to reduce the cuts by 47, then fine. But why shouldn't we have them show to us, where their priorities lie, and especially when we are going to give them reorganization authority that really changes the face of the government, the face, the priorities, everything about the government potentially could be changed by those reorganization provisions in this bill. So I would just ask for the $47 million. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Vice Speaker. On the Vice Speaker's amendment to the amendment, there was an objection. So all those in favor of the Terlahi amendment to the amendment signify by raising your hands, please. Motion fails. We're still on the San Nicolas amendment. Are there any other discussions on the San Nicolas amendment? Senator Espaldon.
Mr. Chair, there's been much discussion of how the $47 million fiscal realignment plan came into being. It was actually in the figures that was sent down by the governor. But in the process of all the discussions over the past weeks that we've been here, and we've had the fiscal team from the executive branch down here, we know that the initial figure was $37 million was their intention of cuts. After the administration had spoken to the various departments and agencies and instrumentalities, what DOE came back with, bottom line, that $37 million encompassed a reduction in budget of about $19 million. DOE made the real attempt to try to see if they could find the $19 million in reductions without affecting the classrooms. In the end, DOE came back and said, we've tried and we've looked everywhere, and what we've been able to come up with was not $19 million of reductions without affecting the classrooms. The real number is $12 million. So, and again, this discussion was entered into because I remember I was the one who was actually questioning the fiscal team from the administration about this. And it was DOE who said they can't meet $19 million, but they can contribute a cost reduction of $12 million. And so the conversation that we were having with the fiscal team of the administration at the time was then, okay, so the $37 million really is not $37 million because DOE can't make up that extra $7 million that was required of them. And then we agreed that $30 million really was the figure in terms of a cost reduction at this point. And I think I can live with that, because if the shortfall in this crisis is $67 million, okay, $30 million is what we can do right now because it's an emergent situation. It hits us square in the face right here, right now. I believe this figure should be $30 million, not 37. It's definitely not 47, right? But I believe that, yes, the intent of this amendment is to have the administration at least own it by coming up with the fiscal realignment plan that shows a $30 million reduction in the government spending over the next 5 to 6 months, at least until the end of the fiscal year. So I would like to at least make an amendment to this amendment that really reflects the conversations that we've had over the past few weeks of what that number should be in terms of the fiscal realignment. I believe it's $30 million. And so at this time, I would like to make an amendment to the amendment to reduce the $37 million to $30 million. That's my amendment.
Thank you, Senator. On the amendment to reduce the amount from 37 to 30 million, we have Senator Castro and Senator Agan, Senator San Nicolas.
I certainly appreciate Senator Espaldon's amendment. I rise in support of that. Given what I referenced earlier, the February 23rd letter, I think at the very least, the governor should be able to stand on his word as submitted with his signature on that date. So I want to thank the mover of that amendment. I think it's a tremendous compromise, and it's actually based on a lot of information that's been presented to us, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Agan?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a general statement for the record in terms of supporting the proposed amendment on the proviso and the understanding that, especially in light of the previous speakers' statements, that any further budgetary reductions and cuts will not be applied towards the Department of Education. So that's really where my support for the amendment of the number down from 37 to 30, specifically with the understanding that, according to the previous speaker, said the governor, he feels comfortable that the governor is going to stick to his word, that there will be no further additional reductions to the Department of Education aside from the numerical figure that was provided to us by the superintendent. So in that particular case, I certainly hope that there's sufficient revenues to be able to ensure that DOE receives the resources necessary to be able to continue the balance of this school year, in addition to summer school, if in fact that's in their schedule of activities, and then moving on into the commencement of the next school year without any interruption or minimal interruption as it applies to our educating our students. So I recognize and I appreciate the mover of the amendment, Mr. Chairman, for explaining the discussions with regards to the figure that he is proposing. I also feel very strongly that this piece of legislation, should it receive sufficient votes by this body, really should have a cost reduction figure above and beyond what the good senator to my immediate left had proffered of $1.7 million. So this is where the commitment comes in terms of making sure that whatever proposal, should it pass this body, has to be inclusive of not only ensuring sufficient revenues to continue the operations of our government, the reorganization of our government to streamline and to cut the red tape, and then also to further reduce the cost of government, at least for the balance of this fiscal year, as we venture into discussing fiscal year 19's upcoming budget. So thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Senator San Nicolas? No, not yet.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, several things need to be clarified. First, there's nothing in the amendment or the amendment to the amendment that says cut DOE. there's nothing there. It speaks to an amount, and the amount is 37 million. Now, of this 37 million, this was an amount that was put to the body by the governor's fiscal team. The amendment to the amendment now wants to bring that number down to 30 million. But if you pull up the governor's fiscal realignment plan that he transmitted, and you look on page 6, line 3, 2% general fund reserve, they have $12 million that they've still allocated to that reserve. If you were to reallocate that 12 million and less it from the $37 million figure, then really what we're looking for is 25 million in cuts. If we drop this down to 30 million, and then you add back that 2% reserve, you're talking about 18 million in cuts, while we've raised taxes on our people by $30 million. It's like for every dollar we increase in taxes, we're only cutting 50 cents. There has to be equity. So I object to the amendment on the premise that in the fiscal realignment plan that we've received already, which by the way does not need to be the one that we pass with respect to the amendment, but in this fiscal realignment plan we received already, they still kept $12 million in the general fund reserve. So that can be offset, and that gives more than enough capacity to be able to make up for that $7 million difference that the Department of Education brought up by $5 million more than their $7 million concern. So I don't think we need to reduce the amount. I think that we need to try, at the very least, as much as possible to keep parity between any tax increases and cuts in the government. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any other discussions on the amendment to the amendment? If not, there was an objection, right? So I'll take a vote on the amendment to the amendment, the Espadon amendment. All those in favor of the Espadon amendment, signify by raising your hands. Motion carries. Senator San Nicolas, you have, or no, who else on San Nicolas amendment? Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise in support of this amendment because I feel that we can't ask more from our people with BPT. We can't ask more from our people with the sales tax unless we as a government are willing to also walk that walk and do more ourselves and give more ourselves. I think that in the course of this discussion, our people have been very clear, at least people that I've met with and I've talked to and people who've called my office, that we cut the cost of government and be accountable for every new dollar that we spend. And so I feel that this amendment will help us to accomplish that. I agree with previous speakers who would like for us to review the fiscal realignment plan and that to ensure that we continue with a focus on our priorities, health, education, and the public safety of our people. So I would like to ask my colleagues to please support this. I thank the mover of the amendment for, raising it another time, and I sincerely hope that it passes. Suzus Masi.
Thank you, Senator Lee. On the San Nicolas amendment, are there any other discussions? If not, there was an objection to the San Nicolas amendment. And so we'll have the mover close now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, relative to the objection, Mr. Chairman, the amendment does not, as I mentioned earlier, mention the Department of Education in any way. It mentions the figure, what is now $30 million. And it doesn't happen automatically. It needs to be enacted, which means this body needs to pass it. So we will have an opportunity to review where those $30 million in cuts is coming from, and at that point we can make the amendments necessary to satisfy the concerns of the body. So I believe that we need to include some language in here that it's going to speak to cuts that our people are expecting. And when those cuts are put before this body for consideration into enactment, that's when we can definitely have a very clear view of what the cuts entail and make amendments from there to satisfy the concerns with respect to the Department of Education, public safety, and everything else. So I humbly ask my colleagues to support this amendment so that we can make sure that cuts are incorporated in the legislation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator San Nicolas. On the San Nicolas amendment,
Mr. Chairman, I just want to get maybe some clarity. The amendment is the act shall be effective no later than 30 days of the enactment of the fiscal realignment plan. Does that change anything does it make major changes to our initial amendment to the bill of the effective date? And how does that impact that?
yes, as we took a break earlier, and so there was that conflict in the amendment that was passed earlier. And so that's why the discussions were being had, that there is that potential conflict according to council. Okay, so we're on the amendment. There was an objection. All those in favor of the San Nicolas amendment signify by raising your hands. Motion carries. Senator San Nicolas, you still have anything else? Senator? If not, Senator San Augustine, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, after all nights and the few days discussion, I motion to rise out of the committee of the whole with a recommendation to place Bill 248 on the third reading file and to immediately vote after engrossment.
Mr. Chairman? Point of order.
Okay, a motion has been made.
And again, I think this is a non-debatable motion. However, if I could just add to this conversation, there's a couple pieces that are missing to this bill to make it more palatable. One is there's no provision to make the sales tax a visible sales tax. I have an amendment that will do that. On top of it, there is also no definition of a general sales tax in this legislation. It's a very simple amendment, and I'd like to try to move it in. Again, under the BPT or the general business privilege tax, there are definitions, and as well as it identifies who the taxpayers are. And again, if we're going down the line of sales tax, one of the benefits that is spoken to very positively by everybody is that at least that tax will be visible. Right now, that is not addressed in this bill. I would like the opportunity to at least have this body entertain that particular amendment.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'll withdraw, but I'd like to make that motion immediately after those two amendments and nothing more. Thank you.
So you're withdrawing your motion for,
Just for the two amendments. Otherwise, I'd keep my motion in place.
Right.
If we're going to have a series of amendments right immediately after that, then I'll stay with my motion. But provided that we have an understanding that we're not going to be here all night and just discussing and just keep. We're actually just twiddling our thumbs. But I understand his motion. I thought that we discussed that earlier already. But okay.
well, there are others that I guess also have some other amendments they'd like to move. And so unless that motion is still on the floor, unless you withdraw it now, then if we give them the opportunity, we want to give everyone else the opportunity as well to proffer.
Point of order, Mr.
Yes.
Chair. I've never heard a motion to do anything after two events that occurred. So I think that we should address if we're doing this in order, address the motion, or I really feel that, you know what? We have been seeing furloughs, we have been seeing 32-hour work week, we have been seeing removal of health services to DOC, we have been receiving a shutdown of our facilities that help the community, that help the children stay out of trouble. So I really think that this is an urgent issue, and we should drive on and not mess around anymore. Let's get this done.
Okay, so that was my, is that we entertain your motion, or it's going to be withdrawn? So what is your pleasure?
Entertain my motion,
Okay,
Mr.
the
Chairman.
motion is non-debatable. There's a motion to rise from the Committee of the Whole with recommendation. Sorry, can you repeat that, Senator?
Rise out of the Committee of the Whole with a recommendation to place Bill 248 on third reading file and to immediately vote after engrossment.
Okay, the motion is to rise of the Committee of the Whole with a recommendation to place Bill 248 on third reading and to immediately vote after engrossment, which of course will give the clerks enough time, come back perhaps sometime 4 p.m. 4 p.m. is good? 4 p.m. tomorrow to vote on Bill 248. So on the motion, there's an objection. So all those in favor of the motion, please signify by raising your hands. Motion fails. So we'll be in recess until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning.